Welcome everybody to another Teaching Academy PD workshop. This morning's workshop is around Brightspace Intelligent Agents, and we'll also be looking at subject awards, which includes badges and certificates. This is an area where we have quite a few people around the uni which have been early adopters, if you will, that have really embraced using these tools and experimented with them in a variety of ways, and we'll have a look at some of those. And basically, it is an area where there is an emerging interest because people are looking for perhaps alternative methods of engagement within their subjects, or potentially they've always wanted to have some kind of artifacts associated with their delivery, but weren't really sure how to accomplish that unless they were just doing it manually. So there's some great functionality available, and we're going to have a look at those. I will provide information around both the awards feature and the Intelligent Agents feature, but I thought how I would actually begin today might be with a little bit of a Menti activity, which of course it's not going to let me do there. Let's just click on it and grab it. And I'll drop this into the chat. And what I'm looking for here really is the idea of whether people are coming into today's session. You don't have to fill this out now if you're not really sure, but really all I'm asking is two questions. One of them is, if you're thinking about using intelligent agents, or you have been, how are you wanting to use them, or what is it that you're trying to achieve? And secondly, the same for awards. If you wanted to put those in, it's always interesting to collect those kind of ideas. You might be surprised that the other people are thinking exactly the same way, or some interesting ideas coming from others as well. So feel free to pop those in. I'm not going to look at those straight away. I'll pick them up sort of periodically to see what people have popped in. But you can answer both of those questions when you like, if you like, how you like. So I will drop back to those at some point. As with all of the PD sessions we run, you're welcome to drop things into the chat. There is a Q&A attached to this. If you wanted to put something into the Q&A, that would inform resources and other things that we develop later on. I may not get to them in the session, however. And I will stop periodically for people to come off mute, ask questions, etc. If you have a burning question, just put your hand up and I will stop my rant and get into your question. All right, so let's talk a little bit about intelligent agents. So I will begin my slideshow. Most of the time we're going to spend in system, but this is just to give a little bit of background. So we'll talk a little bit about intelligent agents. So intelligent agents effectively are automated processes. We did have versions of this available to us in Blackboard, but they had a slightly different title and were not as powerful as what they are in Brightspace necessarily. They use the term adaptive at that point, but what we're getting into in Brightspace is a series of consequences that you set up when certain conditions are met. We'll have a look at the full list of functionality, but basically it's an if, then, sort of if A, then B will happen sort of scenario. So you might call them targeted release conditions with a consequence of some description. And in most instances with intelligent agents, that consequence or action tends to be a communication of some sort, an email. That's the way that it's used probably 95% of the time from what I've seen. I will show you another sort of aspect to it, but most of the time it's people wanting communications to be sent automatically by the system when certain conditions are met. So that's what we have here. The most common scenario is that a templated email will be sent to the user as well as anyone else you want to be notified when that has happened. There is a link in the Padlet there as well to the DLT page around this. All right. Now, a lot of the time agents get used for reporting, which means that the participants or the students in our subject sites have met a particular criteria. Then we get a report, we get a dashboard. It tells us how many have met that condition. And ultimately, if we've sent communications out, we're also able to get a listing of who's got what, who got sent those details. Things you might want to consider with that scenario is maybe I don't want to contact them at all. I don't want to comms. I just want to know who's meeting those conditions. And that's the idea where we set up a dashboard so we can see numbers on who's meeting those specific conditions. So it works as an analytics tool in that respect. And to show you an example of what I'm getting at, if I jump into, let's pick on, all right, we'll go into the AI literacies program. Right, we find our intelligent agents underneath the communication menu. And if I open that up, you're going to see that there are many agents in this site. The first one, for example, is for reporting. There's no communication necessarily with this one. How many people have been enrolled into the subject? So this is a way of me not necessarily having to dig through the class list to get this. At a glance, I get the number right there. I can then get the names and things from it if I need to, but that's one example. I want to know how many students have done particular parts of the subject. So if I've set up a survey, one of the tools in there, this tells me 152 have done it, and it will give me a list, an exportable list into Excel of who those people are. So again, reporting, analytics, etc. around it. No communication necessary. It's just for reporting. Different assessments being done. At a glance, I could go into the assignment dashboard, for example, and see the numbers of students that have submitted, or I can get all of it in this one area. So you can set up a reporting dashboard using intelligent agents, and it doesn't need to send communications out as a result. You could just be using it for yourself. As long as they meet the conditions that you establish, you're going to get that number. Now there's some finessing to that. In one instance, when you create an agent from scratch, it likes to run this report periodically as if it's a new thing, and it won't talk about the people who have met that condition before. You need to tell it to include everybody who's ever done it if you want this number to be accurate. Otherwise, it's just going to be how many have signed up since today, for example. So there's that kind of element of figuring out what the coverage is for the reporting data that you're after. All right, is everyone across that notion that I'm talking about here of setting up a reporting dashboard? I'll show you how to create this, but does that kind of give you not just an idea of how that might work, but maybe some ideas about what you might want to do with it? So have a think about that. Potentially you could put it into the Menti areas that we talked about, but that's just a start. Agents for reporting. All right, as I mentioned as well, when you go into those different areas in the dashboard, you can export them or you can get them on the screen. So you can get a CSV document and then start doing things with that information if you need to. Grab the emails or the names, then set up your own kind of mailing list for things. I mean, you are basically able to capture that information outside of Brightspace. What else can we do with them? You may, and I realize this screen's quite small, let me make it a bit bigger. You may want to think about using intelligent agents for engagement. So at that point, you're measuring engagement, but also if you were setting up a communication afterwards, depending on whether engagement has happened or engagement has not happened, maybe you want communications to happen. This is a fairly common scenario. So for example, if you have students and you want to know if they've touched X, Y, and Z by the census date or before, A, you want to know, and B, you want them to have a communication sent to them. So this is that finger on the pulse type mechanism where you're saying, I want to reach out, but I don't want to have to try and identify them and then manually send that email out. If you've got 1,000 students, if you've got more than 10 students, I would say that this is already something where you might want to consider using an agent for this type of purpose. So at that point, pick up on engagement metrics and then potentially do your outreach through the system. There are ways to personalize this. I'll show you how to do it when we start building our agent in a minute. Again, those that have completed assessments or not completed assessments, as the case may be. Do you want communications to follow as a result? If they've got particular scores within particular tasks, is there an action that you want to happen? So, for example, if you've got students who are maybe passing or coming close to a pass, and maybe there needs to be some type of communication that says you probably want to have a closer look at X, Y, and Z, or that you can actually template this stuff up and have that automatic communication happening. That's quite a common scenario. For those of you that have done the Foundations of Learning and Teaching program, or the old grad cert, for example, they have a number of agents now in place for that certificate that look at not only reminding people as assessment is coming closer, but they've triggered those communications against engagement and also the progression of the subject. So if it runs over 6 months, they've figured out a timeline of events where, in theory, ideally, students would be following and completing certain activities, whether they're submitting tasks or reading parts of the content. And if they haven't, then the agent triggers a communication that reaches out and says, right, you need to be looking at this, you need to be doing this. If you haven't done this already, you need to be thinking about it. And those signposts are throughout the entire subject, essentially, over the course of it. So that's a possibility of breaking down the progression. Maybe you're looking at the 14 weeks or 16 weeks of your subject delivery, for example, and figuring out if there are particular signposts or milestones that you would like this type of activity happening. All right, let's continue. As I mentioned before, it does give you the opportunity to build these into a dashboard, and then to open the dashboard, either looking at the most recent, if you're running it each day, for example, or you can look at the entire history of who has met those conditions. Anyway, enough of the slides. I think it's time we started building an agent so we can get into how this might work. So let's jump into a site where I can't do any damage. And we will begin building an intelligent agent. So in the communications menu, intelligent agents, and I'm going to build a new agent. All right, so some of the obvious ones, we need to give it a name. Don't worry about the description. None of the students are ever going to see it. So as long as your name is descriptive enough, you don't necessarily need anything in there. You can organize them into categories. All that's going to do is give you headings inside your dashboard that organizes the various agents that you've got. The same way that our categories work inside the assignment or the quiz tool, if you're familiar with that. If you create a category, it's just a subheading that organizes different options underneath it. So you can create categories in the agent dashboard as well if you need to. Importantly, there is a status area in the agent dashboard saying agent is enabled. It's off by default. And I'd probably leave it this way until you're ready to set this free out into the wild and get it to start running. But effectively at the moment it is dormant. All right, so there are 3 areas for us to go through here: scheduling, criteria, and actions. We'll work through those. Scheduling, it asks you how often do you want this thing to run. It starts with no schedule, and that would require you to manually click on the agent and say run it. So you could manually tell it to do it without a recurrence. Otherwise, you can tell it to run it once and tell it when, give it a particular date. You could say I want this run every hour, every day, every week, every month, every year. Most commonly from what I've seen, depending on the type of agent, if people are using it for dashboard reporting and wanting to check in on those numbers, quite often they'll set this at weekly so they can kind of have a weekly overview of the types of engagement that are happening within the subject. That's done quite commonly. Otherwise, You might want to set it at daily. And at that point, you could say, I want you to check, particularly if this is about sending a communication out, right? So if I'm wanting to check that things are happening, I just want this to keep running, irrespective of when it runs, um, in which session, for example, this is just going to keep running. And your agents will copy over from a master site into your session sites and keep running. Their settings don't change if it's moved into a master or a session site. So I'm going to set one up that runs every day. Please run every day at 9 a.m. All right, then you can set a start date. So if we're saying, yep, you might as well start it from today. And in this case, I want to run it until the end of session, whenever that might be. So if we turned around and said, actually, this is going to be June sometime. So run it till the end of June. There's my scheduling taken care of. Now we can open up criteria. And we need to specify, oh, I'll stop there. Stuart, go ahead.
Yeah, I've set up in the past, I've set up just as you're going through, and it has to do with that scheduling. What happens if in the first 3 weeks I want a daily thing because I want that kind of information about engagement, but thereafter I may only want to say weekly. Is it
Create two
possible to
agents.
do that?
Not in the one agent, unless you're going in and editing it after the 3 weeks and changing the frequency. I would suggest you create one that goes for 3 weeks. You use the start and the end date, and then copy it, duplicate the agent, and then change the frequency for the second one, starting at that period when you finish the first.
Okay, all right. I was wondering about that. Thanks, Lachlan.
My pleasure. All right, so we're looking at who this is going to impact. Who is it going to pick up? All users means it's also going to look at staff, teaching team, academic integrity officers, everybody in the zoo. So most of the time with what we're talking about, we're probably going to need to identify who this is for. And in most cases, this is going to be students for those of you that are teaching into subjects, right? So we've specified who's impacted. And then we get to go a little bit further in this area where it's saying, I want you to actually look at whether or not they're logging in or not, for example, or whether they've accessed the subject at all. So this would be logging into Brightspace rather than a particular subject. This would be joining a subject. I don't generally use these two. I think there are other ways to get the same result, and I'm going to go into those now. Most of the time in intelligent agents, I use release conditions. So let's have a look at what we can do with release conditions here. So I'm going to create a new one, and now we can look at some of the options. So this is going to pick up on, think of it as every time a student does, and then something in the list, right? So every time a student submits an assignment, and then I can identify which assignment. Every time a student gets feedback on an assignment, for example, we can trigger the agent. Every time a student gets a particular score in a rubric, and this will in fact let you drill down to particular criterion results in a rubric as well, which is quite interesting, but I don't know how far down that rabbit hole I want to go just yet. Every time a student doesn't submit, no submission to a folder. So at that point, we could set a date against this for the end of when an assignment is due. And then if a student hasn't submitted by X and we want an email to go out to them, I would say no submission to the folder by this date, and then the communication email. It looks like you haven't been able to submit this task. As a result, you'll need to do X, Y, and Z, or reach out to me, or do whatever. So this is doing those types of tasks automatically for you. What else have we got there? Awards. We're not talking about awards yet, but we will. If you got a certain award, badge or certificate, then what? We could trigger a communication around that. It'll pick up on checklists if you've used checklists in your site. You could also be looking at whether or not, looking at the class list, so your enrollment in the subject, if they've joined a particular group, it sends a communication. So those of you that are setting up group activities for your students, and you only want the students in that group to get information when they join the group, you can create an agent to do that for you. Student joins group one, this picks up on them joining group one, and then it sends them a communication like the specific information for that group, for example. So if you want a way for them to get that information that no one else is getting unless they join the group, this is how you could do it. Org unit enrollment means enrolling in a subject. So if they've enrolled in the subject, then they get this communication. Section enrollment, well, if they're a particular cohort of students, so Bathurst distance students, they're enrolled in the subject, showing as Bathurst distance, they get this communication, for example. Or if there's no comms, you just get your dashboard with your numbers showing you at a glance who has met that condition. So you can pick up on all sorts of things in release conditions. You can even set multiple release conditions and have them talking to each other. So Bathurst distance students and those that have joined a particular group, showing me that they get a particular communication. So you can layer this to meet the types of conditions you want to put in place. The last option that's in there, date of enrolment in the current org unit. So the date that you were enrolled in a particular subject. And I'll tell you how we've used this. In the Foundations of Learning and Teaching subject, we want to send things out to a student at 2 weeks in, 4 weeks in, 6 weeks in. So what we do is we get the release condition picking up on their original enrolment date, which we know when they're all added, and then we count the number of days to week whatever. And that's when we tell it to run the agent. So if we're saying run this 4 weeks after their enrolment in the current unit, then send this comms. This is how you send out those types of periodic updates to people after they've been enrolled for a certain period of time. There's no other way that you can pick up on week 1 student, week 2 student, week 3 student, week 4 student. You have to use this one, date of enrolment in the unit, and then you tell the report how many days after that you want this to go out. So it's talk to me afterwards if you're interested in setting that up, but it does work. All right, are there any other types of release conditions for us to look at? Looking at particular types of content or not looking at it, that's a fairly common one for people wanting to know if students have been looking at particular materials. What else? Have they posted or made posts in a particular discussion area? It can pick up on that. Have they achieved particular grades? That would be, I'd probably stick to the ones under assignment rather than the actual grades ones. But because that would require all of the publishing, etc., to be finished on a task before it sends out the comms. But if you're happy with that, you can also get it to look at the grade book and say, you got a 64 on this particular task. As a result, we want, this communication to happen, or maybe you just want it for your data. All right, and there's options in there for quizzes as well. There are many, many release conditions, many possibilities for how you might interconnect those release conditions. But the idea is that you choose at least one from the list. So let's say in this case that a student has not submitted a particular task. And now I get to pick which assignment. So let's say they haven't done this second assignment there. And now it's saying student hasn't submitted to this task, and it is running that check currently daily. Maybe I'll set this for the due date after the assessment is due rather than running this particular check every day. And now we get into our actions, which is the most interesting part, I guess. First thing it asks is, do we only want to run this when a student meets the condition for the first time and never again? They won't be picked up in by the agent again, or every time. So if you recall, when I was picking up how many people have enrolled and it's showing me the total number, that's because I've checked the second box, which says every time they meet that value, they show up in the dashboard. Otherwise, they're only going to show up on the day. And again, if we have a look in here, how many people have received this one-off notification? Well, none today, but there have been many in the past. So that's the difference when you create the agent between choosing whether to run it just once to show the number each day or show me the total number forever. All right, now we've got two opportunities here with agents, two things it can do. One of them is, interestingly, it can change their enrollment. Now, I'm not quite sure, and I'd think very carefully about how you use this, if you use it at all. But if they satisfy the criteria, you have the option to change their existing role and put it into a new role. Now, I don't know how that's going to work for us in our subject delivery, and I said it's a little bit risky messing around with student enrollments, but I'll give you an example of how we've used it in an org site, and that is we have students enrolled in the Foundations of Learning and Teaching. Those are the people working through that particular offering. But we also have people enrolled in the Teaching Academy Hub org site as participants who just look at the rest of the content. They're not doing the Foundations of Learning and Teaching, they're accessing the other materials. One of those groups are students, the other group are participants. So at that point we can say, when you've met those conditions, we want to change you from being a participant, from being a student to a participant. And we can shift their enrollment in the site from one to the other. Liz, I can see you nodding your head. Does that make sense to you? Yep, okay, great. All right, so unless you know very clearly what it is that you're going to be doing with enrollments in the subject, maybe steer away from changing their enrollment conditions, or at least reach out to someone in DLT to maybe talk through how that's going to work. But this is probably more something for org sites, I would suggest, than subject sites. We generally leave that to Banner and to our administration teams for messing around with student enrolments at that point. Now, the part that we are probably all interested in is this last one that says send an email. So this is where we get into our communications. And it allows us to specify who's going to get the email. Now, Brightspace uses a thing called replace strings. You may be aware of them. In the Padlet for today, I've actually got a link to the replace strings page. Let me find the link and give it to you in the chat while I talk. Hang on a second. Dashboard, dashboard, dashboard. Hang on, no, I won't do that. Brightspace. Let's replace strings list. Here we go. All right, I'll drop the link into the chat for you as well. But basically what a replace string is text that you can put into your email, either in the title or into the body itself, and it will substitute that word for the person that's reading it with their information, for example. So as an example, what we would normally put in our emails to students to identify their name, we would find ones, and if we scroll through this list, I want to find users. Here we go. So what do we want to go into the email, for example? I want their name, or I want their first name. You can use a replace string, like putting this text with the squiggly brackets in to the body of your email, and it will say, Dear Trudy, for example, based on whoever's reading it. And if Liz is reading the same communication, it'll say, Dear Liz. So it just picks up on it and subs for the individual person's name or detail. And there are many, many other replace strings in here, but the two that you need to know about, firstly, is how to pick up on the individual student's email address to go into the to field, and how to pick up on things like their name, etc., in the body of the email. So if I just move my slides over onto this page so I can make sure I'm not missing anything here. I want to pick up on the name of the student, the email address of the student, find that. Agent emails. Okay. So the one we're looking for here in the to field is curly brackets, capital I, initiating user, capital U. And what that means to us is the student who has met this requirement. So the agent has picked up the student has not having submitted that task at this particular date. I'm going to put their email in here. That's how it figures out who to send this to. So we get our initiating user. Maybe I want to get a copy as well, so I could put my own address in there, or you could nominate someone else, etc. Maybe you BCC things if you don't want people seeing who else it's going to. You could do that as well. Then you put in your subject. Then we get into our body for what it is that you're going to be sending them. Now, this uses the same Brightspace editor that we have within our subject sites, which means if you want to do things like embed media, you could use the insert stuff option, and that would be included inside the email comms to the student. If you wanted to use quick linking and direct the student to particular parts of the subject site in that communication, you could do that. So if you turned around and said, oh, I noticed that you haven't submitted this, have you had a chance to look at X? And then you point them to a particular part of the content and saying, I need you to be looking at, topic 1, 2, 3, etc. So quick linking is very handy. You can use it in your communications just like you do in announcements, for example, if you use that feature. Probably the one thing that you do need to do in here is find a way to personalize this so it doesn't sound like dear insert username, etc. here. It needs to be a little less generic. And one easy way to do that is to use those replace strings I was talking about. So if we have a look in the replace strings list, I want you to pick up on the first name of the user. Okay, there are two that work here. One is initiating user first name. If we use capitals at the beginning of each of those, there we go, initiating user first name. So the person who has met that condition, that's what I'm going to put into my email. And then I can put the body of my text in, and then it will personalize the comms and then send it out. As with other Brightspace communications, you can add attachments to it if you need to, file attachments, etc. You can do that. And lastly, it asks you about email format, HTML or plain text. I generally leave this on as the default for HTML so that it shows up properly in student email applications on their phones. A lot of things, if you leave them as plain text, they're not going to display the way that you're seeing them inside Brightspace. They come out as really bland looking just scrolls of plain text. So leave the HTML on. All right, I'm going to stop there and see if I've lost everybody or if we're on board at this point. Who wants to come off mute and tell me if they're okay with where I'm at or if you've got any questions? Anyone at all?
Yeah, Lachlan, it's Trina here. Thank you. I think I'm following along, maybe. But
excellent.
Just checking, in terms of the initiating user versus just the first name, is there a particular reason why you need to do that?
Right, you mean in the replace strings why I chose initiating user first name instead of first name?
Yep.
Because I always use this and I know it works, whereas this one I've seen actually miss and it just shows first name. I don't know why they've added it to the list when it doesn't always work necessarily, so I go with what works. So initiating user meaning the student that has met the requirements for the condition and it gets their name. First name, I don't know if it's confused and looking for first name of who. I don't know, but it doesn't always work. So I use initiating user first name.
Yeah. And that seems to then make sense in terms of if you're then using initiating user email. So it sort of lines up. Yep.
Absolutely.
Okay, that can just be because that's what works. That's fine.
Exactly. That's good for me, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you.
No worries. Great question. Kristen.
Just wondering with the master to subject site,
Yep.
so when you're setting up the timing and the release conditions for these kind of emails,
Yep.
is it okay just to leave that bit blank because you might not know what it's going to be and the dates are changing and things like that? Because there's sort of a risk if you set it up in the master site with some dates that perhaps that carries over and that doesn't match. So yeah.
That is an excellent point. So it depends where you're starting. If you're creating these agents in the subject site, then you're going to put in the dates for the subject site for that session, right? Makes perfect sense. But if you're copying it into a master from that point, then you'll need to decontextualize it and remove the dates.
Mm-hmm.
If, as you've suggested, and I love the idea of, create it in the master first as its decontextualized version, leave the dates empty, or better yet, if we go back to our agent creation kind of list, where are they, Lachlan? Sample, sample, sample. Make sure that it's unticked, unenabled, and that way it's dormant until you've configured it for the session and then you enable it. So that would kind of be my, I guess, my safety check at that point.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
My pleasure. All right, any other questions at that point? About this process. There are many, many ways that you might set this up to run for you, whether you're setting it up as a reporting dashboard that's just giving you numbers and no comms, or you're using it for that outreach, for the communications, etc. It's worth thinking about. This is arguably, from my perspective, one of the best ways to get analytic data very quickly from Brightspace without having to go down a bunch of rabbit holes. You can actually just say, met the conditions, show me the number. And then I get to go to one screen and see it all arranged in the one place. So I think it's quite powerful. It might not be why they created them in the first place, but it's definitely one way that I use it because I get people saying, wanting to know those numbers. So using agents for reporting, I think, has a lot of potential. Liz.
Thanks, Lachlan. Yeah, it's all making sense. I'm just wondering, is there a way to send a dummy just to test, or would you have to go through and actually adjust the parameters so that it sends a test to yourself? Is there a way to sort of review it before
absolutely.
you kind of put your faith in it and forget all about it?
They have obviously read your mind because there is a feature in here called practice run. And if you do a practice run, it will run through the activity without actually doing the action, right? It'll run it as a report. It'll even give you the numbers of who would be picked up by doing this to show you whether it's working, but it just won't do the action, right? So I could do that now without any fear, right? Do you want to do a practice round of this? Yep, I do that. And then say, great, let's do it. To run an agent usually takes between sort of 2 and 5 minutes. There is a little sort of time period while it goes through the works. And then you run it and it will actually give you the results. You can see this little cog here showing that it's running. And then it will show me the results of that run in a minute. The cog will disappear and this will say, now, just now, 1 minute ago, something like that. Right, but it won't have sent the comms out. So you can absolutely do dummy runs to make sure that it's doing picking up who you want it to pick up before you actually have to worry about the comms going out. It's a great point. Stuart.
Similar to the last question, where I don't want to monitor things, day by day, but I do want to have a good idea. So how would I set up something where I want to know students who have not finished weeks or say module 1, module 2, module 3 quizzes? I don't want to know it module by module, but I want to look at it, the students who have not completed all 3 modules.
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there with how you started that, with saying the module quizzes. If you can set up an artifact or an individual object that they need to have done that will indicate that they've finished, and you don't necessarily want to show that they've just opened the content pages on each, then that will give you something to trigger this against. And you can create an agent for each of them. So for example, if we turned around and said week 3 quiz, right, as one example. Now I'm not going to tell this to count 3 weeks. What I do know is that I have a quiz at the end of week 3 that I get students to do. Maybe it's embedded in your content at the end of the learning materials.
Yeah.
And at that point, the criteria for them having met it would then be under our release conditions. We're going to say we want you to have a look and see who has finished this particular quiz. I want to see that I only want to know the ones that haven't,
Correct.
for example, right?
Yep.
So no completed quiz attempt. I don't have any quizzes in this subject, but at that point you would choose which one. Doesn't like it. Let's do the same scenario with an assignment because I don't have any quizzes in this subject, but it's the same.
Yep.
Same idea, right? So I'm going to say, in that case, it'd be no submission. And then whether you want the report to be run every day, every week, or at a particular date, right? So if you've calculated and said, right, week 3 for me would be the 15th of March, for argument's sake. At that point, you could set your scheduling and say, I want you to do a one-time run. And I put the date in here and say, yeah, 15th of March, I want you to run this report and tell me who hasn't completed that thing. And then I get an agent getting into my dashboard, showing me the numbers that have not met that criteria at that particular date and time. And you would create one of those for each of them, right? That way you get to go to your dashboard and have a look at the list and see weeks 1 week. Maybe you create a category, quiz completion, content completion, whatever, and they're all sitting underneath each other and you can see how many students, which times, etc. So you set up the scheduling and the criteria against the completion of that one quiz. I'm happy to riff about it with you offline if you like, but that's how I would go about it.
I noticed that you can actually add in, where is it, criteria, was it? But I couldn't run it, so I didn't know how it worked because it doesn't have students in it. But you can actually add, so I had quiz 1, module 1 quiz, module 2 quiz, module 3 quiz, all under the release conditions.
Right.
So it did allow you to add more than one, where you've got that personal framework. I could actually add 3, but I couldn't work out how it would actually display that. So I
I guess it's if they've all got different times as well. That's going to be problematic because this is creating scheduling that applies to all of them.
Yes.
So I would probably try and declutter that by creating individual agents for each. That way I could set those specific timings against each. But anyway.
And that would be 3 separate dashboards then? No,
3 separate items in the same dashboard, right? So it's you only get the one dashboard, right? For all of your agents. Yeah.
True. Yeah.
But I would potentially set up a category to capture all of them, so at least they're all sitting together.
Yeah, okay. The category was quizzes. Yeah.
Yep. All right, we got to move on to awards, people, because we're obviously screaming away time-wise. So let's get into this nice and quick. All right, so awards. All right, so awards are an engagement tool. They take 2 forms really. Certificates, where the student gets an artifact that they can take outside of Brightspace. Most usually that basically is a certificate, a PDF certificate file they can print out. And the other way that it can be used is for badges. So badges are essentially a graphic that is of no value outside of Brightspace, as in you can't actually get it out of the system. Now, to show you an example here, and Trudy, I'm picking on you for a second just to show this example because it's a great one. In this subject, they have a whole stack of badges going on. So if we look at maybe last session, or maybe this session, let's try that.
Do this session, Lachlan, that's when it was in.
Excellent. All right, if we go into our subject admin area, scroll down to assessment and awards. Inside the awards area, you can see that in this subject, they have a number of awards. There's 2 tabs up the top. Class list shows me all the students and who's got what. Subject awards will actually show me what awards are available for students. So at the moment, there is a certificate, apparently, that they get given if they read the subject outline. I don't know if that's actually been used or not, but the badges are where it's at for this subject. That's what I'm most interested in. And you can see that when particular conditions are met, the students get sent a little notification saying that they've qualified for these badges, and they sit against their name, and they also sit against their profile, their user profile in Brightspace. So if you went up into your profile area at the top, you actually see these little badges next to you if you went in there. But essentially, when I say it doesn't have any value, it's not me passing some kind of judgment on it not having value. It's simply a visual indication that is used in the subject, and we can get some data around who's got what, but also it sits in the individual's user profile that they can look at and go, I've got this, 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 and this. So essentially, it is an engagement mechanism, but it doesn't sort of kind of go beyond that really in terms of its functionality. And you can see that they have a whole stack in here, as Kelly said a minute ago. Wow, there's heaps of them. And I'm assuming, I'll have a look at these in a second, that these are because students have worked through particular either content, were accessed particular types of content, or potentially completed a particular type of activity. Trudy, am I on the money there?
Yep, it's knowledge check quizzes at the end of each topic, being first year anatomy and physiology, lots of recall. To get the badge, they have to get 80% or greater in the end of topic quiz.
Right. So much like our intelligent agents, we've set up conditions that they have to meet, and the resulting action for this when they meet those conditions is they get a badge, right? Certificates work the same way. You set up the conditions, and then at the end of it, if they've met those, they get the certificate file emailed to them. That's it, very, very simply. We're going to have a look at the mechanics of how we actually make these before I run out of time. All right, so in this case, I'll fool around, not in this subject site, in another spot where I can do some damage. All right, we go into subject admin and awards. Again, it shows me a list of people in here. I've already got some awards in here. And you'll notice as well when you go into this area, interestingly, because of my role in here, it's also showing me the awards that I have and my available awards in the subject, but students don't see that. All right, let's go into subject awards, and we're going to create a new one. So our first scenario is we're going to create a new badge. So I'm going to click on create. New, let's go, new post-Easter badge. Survival. There we go. That'll do. And at this point, we have text that spells out the criteria. So this is really just a description of what's going on here. So managed to get through all the chocolate, avoid family dinners, and even had a walk. There we go. Now I get to choose what award type it is. In this case, we're talking about badges. I'll deal with certificates in a minute. Yeah, I want it to be available in all of my subjects, or I could just have it in this particular subject site. I'll make it available to all. Do I want it to expire? No, that's fine. And the relative time period after you're earning the award, by default, they get it instantly. If you want it to be a delayed release, you can set up days, weeks, months, years, etc. before they get it, but otherwise it's delivered instantly. And if it is going to expire, as in it's only valid for a certain period of time, you can also decide whether or not they get notified that it's going to expire. So maybe if you had some kind of recurring knowledge, skill check, something that they needed to do, you could actually have this notification going back to them when it was approaching that timing. All right, now we get to talk about the image, and the important thing to know, this is in the Padlet as well, is that badges need to be a PNG file, and they need to be 200 by 200 pixels, right? So at that point, we can get out our trusty Copilot, for example, to do this for us. I'm not suggesting that you become a Photoshop wizard unless you're so inclined. And I would say, oh, hey, I desperately need a badge image that is a PNG file, 200 by 200, showing me a hungover Easter bunny. Right, now at that point, Copilot says, yeah, absolutely, I could do that. And then it gives me an image that is way better than anything I would ever be able to do myself, if I'm being perfectly honest. And then at that point, download the image, add the image in here, and off we go. Who says that AI is not a gimmick? Huh? Look at what it can do. We'll wait for that to load in a second. It usually doesn't take too long. Here we go. Hungover. Yes, it's coming. It's coming. But it's going to give me a graphic file that I can then use inside my badges or anywhere else you want to use those images. It's taking its time. Maybe the system is also suffering from post-Easter. Oh yes, I'm liking where this is going. It is taking a little bit of time. All right, excellent. There's my image. Right, download it. I've got a file sitting in there ready to use. I can go back to my award. I'm going to say, upload the new image, please. It was in downloads, I'm assuming. Oh, that could be it. Let's try that one. It does want it to be a certain size. That's interesting. Oh, well, I'll have to keep that in mind. But you get your image in there, upload it, and then you need to put some issuer information in. Now, it depends where you want this to come on. We usually put the CSU information in underneath. Let me just open this up for fault so I can actually see the issuer information that I use. Awards, subject awards, show me the award, issuer information. There's the badge image that we uploaded. Right, so in this case, I've put in the Teaching Academy. The most critical part here is the issuer URL needs to be a valid website. That's important. So if you've got a school page, for example, school website, put that in there. That's fine. But you do need a valid website and an email address underneath to be a part of the badge. They sit underneath as part of the metadata for it. And it won't send it out properly unless you've got a valid website and email to sit underneath the issuer information. Once you upload your badge, an image of it will be underneath for you to have a look at. You can also preview it, for example, if you're using certificates to upload, and I will talk about certificates in a second. But that's basically it for badges. Create as many as you like. For whatever reasons that you want to issue them, they will be issued within the subject itself and are generally regarded as a pretty good engagement mechanism. Let's talk about certificates very, very quickly. Before, when I was making a badge, if I wanted this instead to be a file that the students could take away and print out, we would be making a certificate. And in this case, you then have to use quite a specific template for that certificate. And what I mean by that is, it has to be a PDF file, and it has to be a PDF file that has form fields on the PDF that you can modify. So I'm going to show you what I'm talking about here. Firstly, I've got a certificate that we put together in Word. There's our Word version of it that we could edit and change, etc. And you'll notice in the Word version that I've used some replace strings in here just to tell me where I'm going to want those in the certificate. So every time someone gets this, I want the system to put the student's name in there to pick it up. And in this case, I'm using full name. And let me just make this a bit smaller so I can move it around. The other part we also have is down the bottom, I want it to date it so that it has an accurate date and an accurate name. The rest of it is static information. Everyone gets the same thing. But when the certificate goes out to Trudy for finishing this thing, I want it to say Trudy Fenwick on the 7th of the 4th. Right? So I'm just getting it to customize those two things. I'm only using it in a very simple way. So the rest of it is fine, but I've put in the text for those replace strings into this, and then I make the PDF, right? Save it as a PDF. That's my starting point. But to get certificates to actually work and pick up that information dynamically, you have to use Adobe Acrobat. There are some free, well, I don't know about free. There are some alternatives to using Acrobat around. Or you could log a job and get someone to help you use Acrobat that has access to it. But really, you need to be able to be editing this PDF as a form. And Acrobat is the way that we go about doing that. So in this case, I had that PDF that I just made, and I've added in two form fields. One for where I'm going to put the name, and another one for where I'm going to put the date. And we do that in Acrobat by preparing a form, if you're familiar with Acrobat. So you can add those fill-in areas, but the most important part is you have to be able to edit the properties of those fields. So I'm going to right-click and go to Properties. It's got to be Acrobat Pro, Trina. Yep. The free version doesn't let you edit forms, unfortunately. All right, so inside the properties for those fields, the thing that I'm interested in is this part here, the tooltip. I'm sorry this is so small if you're looking at it on a shared screen, but what you need is to put the text for the replace string, in this case full name inside the squiggly brackets, as the tooltip. That is the only thing that Brightspace cares about. It will look at the field, look at the tooltip, and then automatically populate that information into the certificate. So in this case, I've put the tooltip I need in as full name. And I've done the same down here under award date. If I look at the properties again, the Brightspace replace string for this is award date, curly brackets. And now the certificate, when it prints out in the system, will generate that information automatically on the spot. And we get a certificate with the individual's name in there, and I can find some examples for that. Let's go for, that's a badge. Where's the certificate? Where's the certificate? Completion of program. That'll do. Let's have a look. Actually, if I have a look at the class list. Right, Kelly's got it. Excellent. That's good because it's her program. And if I click on it, it will allow me now to generate the certificate. There's the PDF. And it has populated the name and the date into this automatically. Right, so this certificate, the fields were just up here, very simple. And it has pulled that information on the spot. Right, so that's it in a nutshell. You can make much fancier certificates than what I've done here. But the important part is create a form on your PDF that you've made and put in those fields with the tooltip titles using the replace strings. I'm sorry if I've lost people at that point. I'm happy to go through it with you individually, but that is the trick to making certificates in Brightspace. So the main difference, obviously, badges, you get it in the subject, you get a notification saying, yeah, you got the badge, here's a picture of it, you got the badge. Certificates will give you the artifact. So you get the PDF certificate that you can then take, print it out, stick it in your portfolio, whatever it is that you're going to do with it. That's the difference between those two types of awards. All right, I am aware that we are at time as well. So I am happy to kind of wind things up. I'll stop the recording there, but I will actually pull up that Menti just to see what people popped in as their ideas for this, if anyone did some things. Let me stop the recording though.